All right, so it feels like it was literally just a couple days ago that I was covering that mass shooting at the Tops grocery store up in Buffalo, New York. But, this being the United States of America, we have already, just days later, had another tragic mass shooting, this time at an elementary school where, according to the reports that we have now, obviously this is a, dynamic situation where some of the details may change as we learn more information. But according to NBC News, they are saying that 19 children and 2 teachers have been killed in a Texas elementary school shooting, and they say an 18-year-old suspect was fatally wounded by law enforcement officers, Texas Governor Greg Abbott said. So this law enforcement aspect of this is going to tie back in because it appears like they did have an opportunity to prevent this kid from going into the school in the first place, and they completely failed to do that. But let's go ahead and get into some of the details here. They say at least 19 children and 2 teachers were killed Tuesday when a gunman opened fire in a Texas elementary school, according to the Texas Department of Public Safety. And they say the suspected shooter, who might have had a handgun and a rifle, was also killed when law enforcement confronted him at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, about 83 miles west of San Antonio, Governor Greg Abbott said at a news conference. And he said, quote, "It is believed that he abandoned his vehicle, then entered into the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde with a handgun, and he may have also had a rifle." Now, it's not 100% clear exactly how and where he got this rifle, but we do know that on his 18th birthday, he did go out and purchase a couple of guns. Seems like he did that through legal avenues. So, again, with our massively lax gun laws that we have in this country, it is entirely possible that an 18-year-old kid can go into any given gun store and walk out with rifles that he can then go use to shoot up an elementary school. And we basically have no checks and balances in place to prevent that type of situation from happening. But they continue saying, quote, "He shot and killed horrifically and incomprehensibly 14 students and killed a teacher." Again, those were the initial statements. Seems like the death toll is much higher now, the governor said before additional deaths were confirmed. And they say the Texas Department of Public Safety later said that 19 children and 2 teachers were killed in addition to the suspected shooter. They say multiple survivors, the exact number was not released, were being treated at the hospitals. And it was yet another mass shooting targeting children and educators at an American school campus. And they say Tuesday's attack recalls the deadly shootings at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado in 1999, of course Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida in 2018, and Santa Fe High School in Santa Fe, Texas later in 2018. So just we're doing this on repeat, and absolutely nothing is being done whatsoever to prevent this from happening. But they continue here finally saying it might have particular resonance for those shaken by the December 14th, 2012 attack at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut, when a 20-year-old man killed 20 children and 6 adults. So again, look at the date on this. This is December 14th, 2012. That is 10 years ago, a full decade in which essentially no meaningful gun legislation has been able to pass through our government, even though the overwhelming majority of Americans, depending on which policy you're talking about, support common sense gun reforms, things like universal background checks that we still can't get in this country, even though it has over 90% support according to some polls. So just a completely pathetic and ridiculous and grotesque violence that we allow to be normalized here in the United States. But again, 2012, some of these kids that were 6 and 7 years old at the time of the Sandy Hook Elementary School, they're probably going into high school at this point. And again, still nothing is being done as more and more schools and other locations as well. We saw the shooting at that grocery store. We've seen shootings at movie theaters, basically anywhere. There's no real place in the United States where you are necessarily safe from this kind of shooting, but that's just the reality that we have somehow accepted in this country. But again, more context on the law enforcement side of this. Pretty early details, but according to what we know, it seems like it was pretty much a complete failure by law enforcement officials. And one of the main talking points that you hear from conservatives in a situation like this is, the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Well, it appears like in this case, you actually had armed police officers who were specifically stationed at this school, specifically for a reason like this, or to prevent a situation like this from unfolding. And they managed to engage the shooter before he went into the school and completely failed to prevent him from continuing onwards into the school and engaging in this mass killing of these children. So a little bit of details on this. They say a sergeant with the Texas Department of Public Safety told CNN that the gunman who shot and killed 19 children and 2 adults at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, had been engaged by police prior to entering the building. And they say Sergeant Eric Estrada told Anderson Cooper that the 18-year-old gunman, Salvador Ramos, was actually involved in 2 separate incidents on Tuesday. And he said, "I do want to state that there were 2 different incidents. The first incident was involving the suspect at their grandmother's residence, where he shot the grandmother, and then the grandmother was airlifted to the hospital. Seems like she's in somewhat stable condition now." And they say the second incident that came in was actually involving, they called it an epic crash, and man with a firearm outside the school premises. There were several law enforcement that engaged the suspect, but he was able to make entry into the school, where he did go into several classrooms, and unfortunately, he did fire his firearm inside the school premises. But then he was met with another tactical law enforcement agency, which ultimately were able to bring him down. Unfortunately, there's confirmation now that there are 18, now 19 deceased children and students, and there's 2 deceased adults. So again, the questions here, are very obvious. You had police that were on the school campus that were specifically stationed there, at least in theory, to prevent something like this from happening, and they completely failed to. So how do you get engaged with a shooter who apparently crashed his car near the school, was carrying a firearm or multiple firearms, was fully kitted out in armor and tactical gear, and the police engaged with him but failed to stop him from going into the school? How does that happen? And then, it seems like, according to the details that we're aware of right now, that they then basically waited for a second tactical team to come in and actually go in to confront the shooter. So again, this idea that police are out here putting their lives on the line to sacrifice themselves to protect the broader community, or that police are even necessarily an effective force in preventing something like this, clearly seems like, in this case at least, they absolutely failed in every imaginable way to do their job and prevent this from happening. But again, we don't know 100% of the details, so yet to be seen exactly the extent to which that engagement, as they're calling it, took place. But I'll keep you guys updated if we get more information on that. But now we get to the broader points of some of the arguments that we hear from conservatives in a moment like this, because again, this is not the first time that this has happened, and this is not the first time that we have had to run through these same bullshit arguments that are being put forward by Republican politicians, by conservatives, in defense of this absolutely grotesque reality that we are living in here in the US. But just to put this in perspective, one of the main talking points that you'll hear from conservatives in a moment like this, they'll come out and they'll say things like, again, the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Clearly, that was not the case. You had armed police officers that were on the premises at the time. They failed to stop this shooting from happening. But on top of that, another argument that you'll hear is, this isn't a gun problem, this is a mental health problem. Well, there's 2 responses to that. Number one, the immediate response would be, if you actually think that this is a mental health problem, then why don't we have universal mental health care in this country and provide that for the American people, so that they have access to that as a means to rehabilitate or to address some of the mental issues that they are facing. But conservatives, if you propose something like that, will turn around and they will literally call you an evil radical commie for proposing the idea of some variants of universal health care. So you can say it's a mental health issue, but what the fuck are you actually willing to do to address the issue of mental health? And the answer to that is absolutely nothing from conservative politicians. But again, it's not a mental health issue. The United States is not an outlier on the global community in terms of issues regarding mental health, but we definitely are an outlier according to all of the data that we have on how many guns we have circulating this country and how easy it is for people to just go out and get these mass murdering machines. So here from BBC, they give us a couple graphs to put it in perspective. They say top 10 civilian gun-owning countries, estimated number of firearms per 100 residents. And you can see here, number 2 on the list is Yemen, all right, and they even have a 52.8 rate of firearms per 100 residents. And we are twice, more than double the number 2 country on this list, sitting at 120.5 guns per 100 residents. So in other words, we literally have more guns in circulation in this country than we even have people. So, clearly this is in fact a gun issue. It is not necessarily an isolated mental health issue or anything like that. It is overwhelmingly, according to the data we have, very obviously a gun issue that we have, an oversaturation with guns, and also just the culture of guns that we have in this country, where again, it's basically impossible for us to pass meaningful legislation because of, things like the influence of the NRA and an extreme right-wing minority that chooses to interpret the Second Amendment as meaning that people should be able to have AR-15s and other assault weapons that is purely designed for the sake of killing human beings. But nonetheless, that is a reality that we live in, and so it leads to results like this. Another graph, they say an international comparison of gun-related killings as a percent of all homicides. So again, gun control measures are never going to be perfect. They're never going to prevent every single mass shooting or every incidence of violence with guns, but nonetheless, you can see here in other countries that have somewhat more strict gun laws on the books, they have significantly less incidents proportionately of guns that are used in homicides. So, and it's really not even fucking close here. I mean, you can see the US in 2020, 79% of all homicides used guns involved in those. In the UK, you got only 4%. In Canada, you got 37%. In Australia, only 13%. So again, clearly, when you're a vast outlier compared to the global community on gun ownership and the amount of guns we have in this country, clearly there is a direct correlative measure here that we can identify between the amount of guns that we have circulating this country and the amount of gun deaths and the amount of mass shootings that we have in this country. It seems like you're just being willfully ignorant if you don't see that correlation there. But now we get to some of the conservative responses that we have seen and typically do see on repeat, basically, in moments like this. So to start us off here from Ted Cruz, I'm not going to play the full video, but basically, as the headline here says from Aaron Rupar, he says, Ted Cruz proposes armed cops in elementary school to deter school shootings. Okay, now obviously he must not have known at this time that the school in question here, the Robb Elementary School, did in fact have multiple armed police officers that were on the premises at the time of this shooting. So, they're coming out here and proposing solutions that were literally just demonstrated in the shooting that he's talking about to be completely ineffective in this sense. So this is one of the bullshit responses that you will typically see from conservatives. Obviously, the answer is not to flood more guns into the streets, not to give teachers weapons, which is another insane proposal that conservatives have floated out there. But very clearly, a good guy with a gun is unable to prevent a bad guy with a gun from conducting this type of mass shooting. But that's what Ted Cruz had to say. We also had the classic here from Mitt Romney talking about thoughts and prayers. Here's what he had to say. He says, grief overwhelms the soul, children slaughtered, lives extinguished, parents' hearts wrenched, incomprehensible. I offer prayer and condolence, but know that that's grossly inadequate. We must find answers. So again, yeah, it is grossly inadequate, and you are grossly inadequate because you're saying we need to find answers. Well, we have some answers. I mean, again, no gun control measure is ever going to be 100% rock solid, but clearly, according to all of the data that we have, comparing ourselves to these other countries that have different gun laws to us, we know that it would have some measurable effect to implement some common sense gun reform laws in this country. It would have some measurable effect in reducing the likelihood and reducing the capacity for people to go out and buy some of these weapons that are used in a lot of these mass shootings. And it seems like overwhelmingly the vast majority of these mass shootings are done with the same fucking gun. It's almost always AR-15s or other various assault weapons that people are going out and obtaining legally or illegally in some cases. But nonetheless, this answer is obviously, as he says, grossly inadequate, and he has no intention whatsoever for finding answers. And as pointed out down here in the responses, they say Mitt Romney is America's #1 recipient of NRA money with $13.6 million in NRA contributions in his bank, and they put together a full list here, but I had another perspective that lists all of those, so we'll go over that here in a second. But another response that we had here from Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton to this massacre. This was basically immediately in the wake of this, so I wanted to go ahead and play this and show you guys and demonstrate exactly how little they actually care about addressing the underlying issues in regards to this.
Yeah, today we've had individuals already weighing in on the left wing, Mr. Paxton, talking about this being evidence of having to take away firearms from law-abiding citizens, as if that type of remedy would have somehow prevented this tragedy. When you hear the instantaneous politicization of an incident like this, what goes through your mind as the head attorney of the state of Texas?
Well, look, people that are shooting people, that are killing kids, they're not going to follow. They're not following murder laws. They're not going to follow gun laws. So this idea that somehow if you ban guns from law-abiding citizens, somehow these people that kill people, they're going to follow the gun law, but they won't follow the murder laws. is somewhat ridiculous, but it seems to be the argument that they make. And they always forget that these are not law-abiding citizens. They're the ones that kill people. So it makes no sense to me. I'd much rather have law-abiding citizens armed and trained so that they can respond when something like this happens, because it's not going to be the last time.
All right, so, I mean, again, listen to the types of arguments that he's floating out there at the end, talking about how we need, of course, more guns to somehow prevent this from happening, even though, again, you had multiple armed police officers who engaged the shooter before he even went into the elementary school, so very obviously that is not a solution to the problem. And the other main point that he was making there is, how everybody is trying to politicize this, and they're trying to say we need to take away guns from law-abiding citizens, and how these types of people who do mass shootings, they're not law-abiding citizens in the first place, so why would they follow any of the gun laws? That is just straight up an argument against all laws on the books, because again, if you're saying they broke the murder laws, so why would they abide by gun laws? Well, if they broke the murder laws, then under your same logic, why would we have the murder laws in place? Why not just legalize murder? Because anybody who's going to go out and murder people is just going to do it regardless of whether or not that law is on the books. So completely deranged and delusional arguments that are being put forward, this time by the Texas Attorney General. Okay, ironic here, he is the lead attorney general for the state of Texas, and he is literally making an argument that is pretty much calling for an end to all laws, because apparently criminals just don't abide by any of the laws in the first place, so why would we have them at all? But again, completely ridiculous. Obviously, again, no gun law is going to be perfect and airtight, but you can have a measurable effect on reducing the likelihood or reducing how easy it is for people to go out and get these types of firearms in the first place. But nobody really is calling to take away guns from law-abiding citizens. I myself, I don't have a problem with people who are safe gun owners from having those in their possession, whether that's for personal protection or whether that's for hunting or whatever it may be. I don't have a problem with gun ownership necessarily, but I do think that there should be some standards in place to make sure that you are aware of how to own a gun safely, how to use a gun safely, as well as putting in some preventative measures to make sure that young people or people in general who are having these mental health issues, or people who are just have a history of whether it's domestic violence or any assortment of other issues, that they are not able to go out and get firearms as easy as they are now. So there again are measurable steps that we can take, but nonetheless nothing is being done about it whatsoever. And part of the reason why nothing is able to be done about it is because we have a massive lobby here in the United States with the NRA that is giving millions of dollars specifically to these Republican politicians here to basically prevent any meaningful gun legislation from taking place. Even bills like, again, universal background checks that are supported by upwards of 90% of the population. So here from Qasim Rashid, he points out NRA contributions to GOP senators. Some of the top ones, you got Mitt Romney, Richard Burr, Roy Blunt, Tom Tillis, Cory Gardner, Marco Rubio, Joni Ernst, Rob Portman, and the list just goes on and on and on. Literally hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars that are being dumped into the campaigns of these politicians, effectively as bribes, again, to put them in place to do absolutely nothing whenever it comes to gun control legislation. But on top of that, not only are they preventing any meaningful action from taking place, not only are they trying to sprint full speed in the opposite direction and suggesting things like teachers should be armed and we need to have more citizens with guns in their hands in the case of something like this happening, but on top of that, as pointed out here by Kyle Griffin, at the moment, Republicans Greg Abbott, Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump are all scheduled to speak at the NRA's annual meeting in Houston in 3 days. Houston is only a few hundred miles away from Uvalde. So again, absolute demons, and we'll see if they back off from going and showing up to this, but I honestly doubt that they will. But literally, as they point out here, just a couple hundred miles away from where this shooting took place, they're going to actively support one of the lobbies that is preventing any meaningful action from taking place on gun control. We also, of course, have the typical corporate ghouls within the Democratic Party as well. This time, Manchin is coming out and saying that he, in theory, as he does with pretty much all legislation that has been put forward, coming out and saying he is, in theory, okay with gun reforms, but says that he's not in favor of doing the one thing that would actually enable gun reforms to be put in place at the legislative level. So completely useless, obviously contradictory. You can't say that you're in favor of legislation while actively campaigning against the avenue that is available for you to actually pass that legislation. It's a direct contradiction, but nonetheless exactly what we would expect from a ghoul like Joe Manchin. But But on top of that, you also have Joe Biden, who doesn't appear willing to challenge the members of his own party to get something like this passed. And on top of that, you also have some of the leadership within the Democratic Party, like Chuck Schumer, who is coming out and saying that he does not plan to even introduce any legislation to force the vote, essentially, and take down members' names and see exactly where people stand on various gun reform bills that they could put forward. But here from Jake Sherman, he says, Americans can make a choice. Schumer says Americans can cast their vote in November based on how people stand on guns. Schumer says Republicans can work with Democrats now to craft a bill. He's skeptical, unlikely, burnt in the past. So, again, you are never, ever going to get Republicans to work with you on meaningful gun control legislation. That's very obvious. That has never been able to be done. But nonetheless, he's basically saying that the only solution, as usual, is to vote harder. So, there's no dynamic here that's going to change. Even in a dream scenario, assuming that Democrats don't continue to be on pace to get curb stomped in the 2022 elections, still, they are pretty much going to be in the same situation that they are right now. If they maintain the bare lead that they have right now in the Senate, or if they even manage to pick up a couple more senators, they're going to be right back in the same position, and you're going to still have to get rid of the filibuster in order to pass this. And it just doesn't seem like, as usual, that there is any motivation whatsoever to get something done, either from Republicans or Democrats. And so, unfortunately, hate to end this video off on a dark note, but I mean, pretty much the whole thing has been dark. But as usual, here in the United States, this type of death and violence is just so baked into our culture at this point, so normalized and accepted, that it really seems like we're just going to pass on by this, and that no meaningful gun reform is going to take place in this country.